800 years. That is longer than the Ottoman Empire lasted. Longer than the entire span of medieval Europe. And it is how long Britain spent trying to solve Ireland. In those 8 centuries, the English and British crowns sent soldiers, settlers, landlords, and laws. They planted colonies, rewrote religions, engineered famines, and partitioned a nation with a single stroke of a pen. And still, the problem was never solved. How does a relationship between 2 islands, separated by as little as 12 miles of sea, become one of the longest, bloodiest, and most unresolved entanglements in all of recorded history? In this documentary, we will trace every chapter of that story, from the first papal blessing that handed Ireland to an English king, to the modern border that still has the power to unravel a continent's peace and uncover the forces that made 800 years of history impossible to forget. Long before English boots ever touched Irish soil, Ireland breathed with its own ancient rhythm. It was a world of dense oak forests, mist-wrapped hills, and a people who had built something remarkable in the furthest corner of the known world. For centuries, Ireland was organized not as a single nation, but as a constellation of kingdoms, each ruled by its own king, each bound by the intricate laws of the Gaelic clan system. The Brehon laws governed everything from land inheritance to the compensation owed for a stolen cow. Above the regional king sat the High King, whose ceremonial seat at the Hill of Tara in County Meath stood as the spiritual and political center of the island. Yet the title of High King was always contested, always fragile, held together by prestige and force rather than any lasting institution. What Ireland lacked in political unity, it more than compensated for in spiritual and intellectual life. From roughly the 5th century onward, Irish monasticism exploded into what historians would later call a golden age. The monasteries at Clonmacnoise, Kildare, and Iona became beacons of learning at a time when much of continental Europe was collapsing under the weight of barbarian migrations. Irish monks copied manuscripts, illuminated the Gospels, and sent missionaries across Scotland, Francia, and beyond. The Book of Kells, that breathtaking treasure of medieval art, was likely produced in this era, its swirling figures a testament to a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. Then came the Vikings. Beginning in the late 800s, Norse longships appeared off the Irish coast with terrifying regularity, raiding monasteries, seizing captives, and disrupting centuries of settled life. But the Norse were also pragmatic settlers. They planted roots. By the 10th century, their trading settlements had grown into the island's first true towns. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, all began as Viking foundations, their street names still carrying traces of Old Norse centuries later. The Irish fought back, and no figure loomed larger in that resistance than Brian Boru. Rising from the Kingdom of Munster, Brian hammered his way to the High Kingship through 2 decades of relentless campaigning. In 1014, at the Battle of Clontarf near Dublin, his forces shattered a Norse and Leinster alliance in one of medieval Ireland's most celebrated engagements. Brian himself did not survive the day, cut down in his tent as the battle drew to its close. He died a victor, but his death left a wound. Without Brian's iron hand, Ireland splintered again. The following century and a half saw endless cycles of warfare between competing dynasties, the O'Briens, the MacArthurs, the O'Neills, and the O'Connors, each grasping for supremacy that none could hold. It was precisely this fracture that would open a door. And through that door, in 1166, would walk a displaced Irish king carrying an invitation that would change the island forever. The document that would reshape Ireland's fate arrived not from an English king, but from the one place whose authority transcended all earthly crowns. In 1155, Pope Adrian IV, the only Englishman ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter, issued a papal bull known as the Laudabiliter. Its message was extraordinary. Adrian granted Henry II of England the right to enter Ireland, to bring its church into closer conformity with Rome, and to rule its people as their lord. With a stroke of his pen, the Pope had gifted an island he had never seen to a king who had not yet asked for it. For years, the Laudabiliter gathered dust. Henry had wars closer to home, rebellions to suppress, a vast continental empire to manage. Ireland remained, for the moment, beyond his reach. But the claim sat waiting, like an ember that needed only the right wind. That wind came in the form of Diarmait mac Mercada, the deposed king of Leinster. Driven from his kingdom in 1166 by a coalition of rival Irish kings, Diarmait refused to accept exile quietly. He crossed the sea to find Henry's court, knelt before the Angevin king, and made an offer that was also a plea. In exchange for help reclaiming his throne, Diarmait would accept Henry as his overlord. Henry, preoccupied elsewhere, gave him something short of an army, but more than nothing. He gave him permission to recruit. Diarmait moved through Wales, offering land and titles to any Norman lord willing to roll the dice on an Irish campaign. The most consequential man to answer that call was Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, better known to history by his nickname, Strongbow. He was a man of fated fortune and considerable ambition, and Diarmait's offer, including the hand of his daughter Eoife in marriage and the inheritance of Leinster itself, was exactly the kind of gamble a desperate nobleman might take. In August of 1170, Strongbow landed near Waterford with roughly 1,200 men. The Normans were not the largest force ever to set foot in Ireland, but they were among the most formidable. Their armored knights, their archers, their disciplined formations represented a form of warfare Ireland's warriors had rarely encountered. Within days, Waterford fell. The ancient Viking city, with its stone walls and deep harbor, became the first significant prize of the Norman adventure. Dublin followed within weeks. The city that Norse settlers had built 4 centuries earlier now changed hands again, passing into Norman control with startling speed. Diarmait was restored to Leinster. Strongbow claimed his bride, and the Normans, who had arrived as hired soldiers, were beginning to look dangerously like settlers. The news reached Henry II with unmistakable urgency. A powerful Norman lord planting himself in Ireland, potentially building an independent power base beyond royal control, was precisely the kind of development no medieval king could tolerate. The Laudabiliter had given Henry a claim. Strongbow's success had given him a reason to use it. By the autumn of 1171, Henry himself would cross the Irish Sea, leading an invasion force of overwhelming size. What Strongbow had seized for himself, Henry intended to bring firmly under the English crown. The foothold was established. Now came the question of who would actually hold it. The fleet that appeared off the Irish coast in October of 1171 was unlike anything the island had ever witnessed. Henry II arrived at Waterford with approximately 4,000 men-at-arms, the largest military force yet assembled for an Irish venture. But Henry was too shrewd a politician to rely on force alone. He understood that in Ireland, as elsewhere, a king who could compel submission without bloodshed was a king who could afford to spend his soldiers on the next war. He barely needed to draw a sword. One by one, the Norman lords who had carved out their Irish territories under Strongbow's shadow came forward to kneel. Strongbow himself submitted without resistance, surrendering his claim to Leinster and receiving it back, not as a conquest, but as a gift from the crown. The distinction mattered enormously. What had been seized by private ambition was now held by royal permission, and permission could be revoked. Then came the Irish kings themselves. This was the more remarkable development. From across Munster and Leinster, Gaelic rulers traveled to Waterford and later to Lismore to offer their submission to the English king. They came bearing gifts, pledging loyalty, and accepting, at least in ceremony, a new hierarchy of power. Henry received them with considerable ceremony of his own, dining with Irish kings at a specially constructed banqueting hall, demonstrating through ritual and theater that he was not a warlord but a sovereign. The church, too, fell into line. At the Synod of Cashel in 1172, Irish bishops formally acknowledged Henry's lordship and agreed to bring Irish ecclesiastical practice closer to Roman custom. The Laudabilitors' original promise that Henry would reform the Irish church was at least symbolically fulfilled. For Henry, who was still recovering from the catastrophic scandal of Thomas Becket's murder 2 years earlier, the endorsement of Irish clergy carried real political value. What Henry was constructing was not quite a conquest in the traditional sense. He had no intention of personally governing Ireland. Instead, he was laying the framework of what historians would later recognize as colonial administration. He appointed Hugh de Lacy as custodian of Dublin and granted him Meath, creating a counterweight to Strongbow's influence in Leinster. He confirmed the rights of existing Norman settlers while placing them unambiguously beneath royal authority. He planted the seeds of English feudal law on Irish soil, introducing systems of land tenure and governance that would grow, over centuries, into something far more elaborate and far more contested. By the spring of 1172, Henry had sailed back to England, leaving behind a transformed political landscape. He had been in Ireland less than 6 months. Yet the implications of those months would echo for 800 years. The final formal chapter of this opening episode came in 1175, with the Treaty of Windsor. Rory O'Connor, the High King of Ireland, the man who had once held the closest thing the island had to unified Gaelic authority, signed an agreement that formalized his own diminishment. Under its terms, Rory acknowledged Henry as his overlord and agreed to collect tribute for the English crown. In return, Henry recognized Rory's authority over the parts of Ireland not already under Norman control. It was, on paper, a compromise. In practice, it was the moment the Gaelic political order accepted, however reluctantly, that the rules of the island had permanently changed. The treaty drew a line, not a clean one, but a line nonetheless, between the expanding world of Norman settlement and the retreating world of Gaelic Ireland. Over the following decades, that line would prove impossible to hold. Norman lords pushed further into the island. Gaelic kings resisted, adapted, and sometimes absorbed their new neighbors in ways neither side had anticipated. Henry II had set foot in Ireland for less than a season, but the footprint he left behind would never quite be lifted. The question now was what the men he left in charge would do with the authority he had granted them, and how long it would take for that authority to begin pulling Ireland and England into deeper conflict. What Henry II had built in Ireland was, in truth, more promise than structure. The lordship he established looked impressive on parchment, but governing a distant island from an English throne was a different matter entirely. Within a generation of his departure, the cracks were already showing. The Norman lords who had come to Ireland as servants of the crown were becoming something else entirely. Far from royal supervision, surrounded by Gaelic neighbors whose culture was ancient and whose land was rich, men like the Fitzgeralds, the Burkes, and the Roches began to adapt. They married Irish women. They fostered their children in Gaelic households, as Irish custom demanded. They learned the language, patronized Irish poets, and adopted the Brehon laws that had governed the island for centuries. A phrase would eventually emerge to describe this transformation, that the settlers had become more Irish than the Irish themselves. It was not simply a colorful expression. It was a genuine crisis from the English crown's perspective of colonial identity. By the mid-13th century, the Norman colony had fragmented into a patchwork of semi-independent lordships. The great magnate families owed nominal loyalty to the English crown, but in practice they pursued their own feuds, alliances, and ambitions with little reference to Dublin, let alone London. The effective reach of English governance shrank steadily inward, contracting toward the eastern coastline until it encompassed little more than a narrow corridor of territory around Dublin. This fortified zone, the Pale, became the true boundary of English Ireland. Beyond it lay a different world entirely. Then came a shock that nearly shattered what remained. In the spring of 1315, Edward Bruce, brother of the Scottish King Robert the Bruce, landed in Ulster with an army of battle-hardened veterans. The Scottish Wars of Independence had just produced one of the most stunning military upsets in British history, and Edward Bruce arrived in Ireland with momentum, ambition, and the explicit goal of driving the English from the island. He found willing allies among Gaelic lords who had never truly accepted the Norman order. For 3 years, Ireland burned. Bruce's forces swept through Ulster and into Leinster, winning battles and devastating the countryside. Combined with a catastrophic famine that gripped the island between 1315 and 1317, the invasion killed tens of thousands and reduced whole regions to ruin. The colony trembled. Dublin itself was briefly threatened. But Bruce overreached. He was crowned King of Ireland in 1316, a symbolic claim that disguised his failure to build durable Irish support beyond a narrow coalition. In October of 1318, at the Battle of Falkirk near Dundalk, Edward Bruce was killed. His army collapsed. The invasion was over. The colony had survived, but it emerged diminished and shaken. The Gaelic resurgence Bruce had helped ignite did not die with him. Irish lords across the island pressed their advantage throughout the following decades, reclaiming land and authority the Normans had once seized. The great magnate families, now thoroughly Gaelicized, were little help to the crown. Many had simply joined the other side of the cultural divide. By 1366, the situation had grown desperate enough that the English Parliament meeting at Kilkenny passed a set of laws that would have seemed extraordinary to Henry II. The Statutes of Kilkenny forbade the English settlers from speaking Irish, from marrying Irish spouses, from fostering Irish children, from using Brehon law. The laws were an attempt to reverse, by legislation, what 2 centuries of proximity had naturally produced. That such laws were considered necessary said everything about how completely the original colonial project had been transformed. The English had come to Ireland to impose their world. Instead, Ireland had begun to absorb them. The Statutes of Kilkenny represented, in the bluntest possible terms, a confession of failure. Passed in 1366 under the authority of Lionel of Antwerp, the Duke of Clarence and son of King Edward III, they attempted to do by law what geography, culture, and 2 centuries of daily life had made practically impossible. The statutes were sweeping in their ambition. English settlers were forbidden from speaking the Irish language, from wearing Irish dress, from riding horses in the Irish fashion, from intermarrying with the native population. Even the ancient custom of fostering children in Irish households, which had proved so powerful in dissolving colonial identity, was explicitly banned. The penalty for violation was forfeiture of lands and imprisonment. The English crown was drawing a line between 2 peoples who had spent generations deliberately blurring it. But who would enforce these laws? The answer, across most of Ireland, was nobody. Beyond the Pale, English authority existed largely in name. Gaelic lords governed their own territories by Brehon law, as they always had, entirely indifferent to proclamations from Dublin. The great magnate families, the Fitzgeralds, the Burkes, the Butlers, had absorbed Gaelic customs so completely that many would have found themselves technically in violation of the very statutes designed to protect their Englishness. The laws applied, in any practical sense, only to the narrow strip of territory where English courts could actually function. For the next century and a half, this fundamental absurdity defined English Ireland. The Crown periodically sent new governors and new proclamations. Parliaments met in Dublin and passed new legislation. None of it substantially changed the reality on the ground, which was that English authority had contracted to a fortified perimeter while Gaelic Ireland carried on largely undisturbed beyond it. The most striking symbol of this reality was the rise of the Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare. By the late 15th century, the Fitzgeralds had become so powerful that successive English kings found it simpler to govern Ireland through them than to attempt direct rule. Garrett More Fitzgerald, the 8th Earl of Kildare, effectively ran Ireland as his personal domain for decades, answering to the Crown in theory and to himself in practice. The breaking point came in 1534. Garrett Og Fitzgerald, the 9th Earl, was summoned to London under suspicion of disloyalty. His son, Thomas Fitzgerald, known as Silken Thomas for the silk fringes worn by his retinue, renounced his allegiance to the English crown in a dramatic ceremony and launched open rebellion. It was a spectacular gamble, and it failed. The rebellion was crushed. Thomas and 5 of his uncles were executed at Tyburn in 1537. The Kildare ascendancy was finished. But its collapse forced a question the English crown could no longer defer. Ireland could not be managed through cooperative magnates, and it clearly could not be left alone. Something new was required. The age of the Reformation was about to make that question considerably more complicated. Something new arrived with Henry VIII, and it arrived with characteristic force. The collapse of the Kildare Rebellion had stripped away any pretense that Ireland could govern itself on England's behalf. Direct Tudor control was now the only option on the table. But direct control required something more fundamental than new governors or stricter laws. It required a new legal and political architecture for the entire relationship between the 2 islands. In 1541, Henry took the decisive step. The Irish Parliament, meeting in Dublin, declared him King of Ireland. The significance of this change was more than ceremonial. Previous English monarchs had held the title Lord of Ireland, a papal grant stretching back to the 12th century. Henry, having broken with Rome entirely, could hardly continue ruling Ireland under a pope's authority. The new title swept that contradiction away. Ireland was now, in theory, a kingdom in its own right, with the English monarch at its head. The instrument Henry chose to extend his actual authority was a policy known as surrender and regrant. The logic was deceptively simple. Gaelic chieftains would formally surrender their lands to the crown, then receive them back as royal grants, transforming ancient tribal territories into English-style feudal estates. They would adopt English law, English customs, English titles. The fierce independence of the Gaelic order would be dissolved, quietly and legally, without the expense of wholesale military conquest. It worked in its fashion for a time. Con O'Neill, the most powerful chieftain in Ulster, submitted to Henry in 1542 and emerged as the Earl of Tyrone. Other great Gaelic lords followed. On paper, the map of Ireland was being redrawn. Chieftains who had never acknowledged any external authority were now nominally Tudor noblemen. But the policy carried a fatal weakness. Under Gaelic tradition, land belonged to the clan, not to any individual, and leadership passed through election among eligible male relatives rather than through inheritance from father to son. Surrender and regrant attempted to impose English inheritance rules onto this system overnight. The result was predictable. A chieftain might submit and receive an earldom. His tanist, the traditional heir elected by the clan, would simply refuse to recognize the arrangement. The same territory would have an English earl and a Gaelic chief simultaneously, each claiming legitimate authority. Beneath all of this lay the question that would prove most explosive. Henry's Reformation had transformed the Church of England, and the dissolution of the monasteries was extended to Ireland with similar thoroughness. The great monastic houses were seized and dissolved throughout the 1540s, their lands redistributed to loyal settlers and compliant lords. But Ireland would not follow England's spiritual path. The Reformation simply did not take hold. The network of Gaelic clergy, the deep roots of Catholic devotion in the countryside, the absence of an educated Protestant preaching tradition in the Irish language, all of it meant that ordinary Irish people remained overwhelmingly and stubbornly Catholic. By the time Henry died in 1547, and through the brief, complicated reigns of Edward VI and Mary I that followed, the fault line was already visible. English authority in Ireland was now inseparable from Protestant identity. Irish resistance was hardening around the Catholic faith. Religion, which had never previously divided colonist from native in any meaningful way, had become the sharpest possible marker of loyalty and opposition. The stage was set. What had begun as a problem of governance was becoming something far more dangerous, a conflict with a theological dimension that neither side could compromise without surrendering something essential. The full weight of that transformation would fall on the reign of Elizabeth I. The Ireland that Elizabeth I inherited was already smoldering. The fault lines exposed under her father's reign now cracked open entirely, and the last 4 decades of the 16th century would bring a scale of violence that neither side had yet imagined possible. The first explosions came in Munster. The Fitzgeralds of Desmond, one of the oldest Anglo-Norman dynasties in Ireland, found themselves caught between the old Gaelic world they had long since absorbed and the new Protestant order demanding their complete submission. The first Desmond Rebellion, erupting in 1569, was suppressed with considerable force. The second, beginning in 1579, was something altogether different. Pope Gregory XIII sent a small expeditionary force of Italian and Spanish soldiers to the southwest coast in 1580, landing at Smerwick Harbor in Kerry. English forces under Lord Grey surrounded the garrison. When it surrendered, roughly 600 men were massacred on the beach. Among the officers carrying out the killing was a young Edmund Spenser, later to write The Faerie Queen, who saw nothing in the slaughter to trouble his conscience. The Desmond earldom was destroyed entirely. Hundreds of thousands of acres across Munster were declared forfeit to the crown, and the province that followed years of scorched earth warfare was, in the words of contemporary observers, emptied of people. Spenser himself described the landscape where survivors crept out of the woods looking like skeletons. Into this deliberately cleared space came English planters, given land grants on condition they settle English Protestant tenants. Sir Walter Raleigh received 40,000 acres. The Plantation of Munster was the first systematic attempt to replace an Irish population with an English one. It would not be the last. But Munster, devastating as it was, turned out to be a prologue. The real test came from Ulster, where Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, had spent decades cultivating English trust while quietly building something extraordinary. O'Neill had been raised partly in the English Pale, educated in Protestant households, granted his earldom through the very surrender and regrant process the Tudors had devised. He understood English military thinking from the inside. And when he finally raised his standard in 1593, he brought with him an Irish army trained in continental tactics, armed with modern firearms, capable of fighting in open formation rather than the traditional Gaelic methods English commanders had learned to defeat. The 9 Years' War shook the entire edifice of English power in Ireland. At Yellow Ford in 1598, O'Neill inflicted the worst defeat on an English army in Irish history, killing over 2,000 soldiers and sending the province of Ulster into open rebellion. For one extraordinary moment, the whole colonial project seemed to tremble. What might have followed? If Spanish support had arrived in strength, if O'Neill and his allies had managed to coordinate a nationwide rising, the answer remains Ireland's great unanswered question. Instead, Spain sent a fleet to the wrong place. 3,500 soldiers landed at Kinsale on the southern tip of the island in 1601, impossibly distant from O'Neill's Ulster stronghold. O'Neill marched his army the length of Ireland through winter conditions, an astonishing logistical feat, only to face an English force under Lord Mountjoy between himself and the Spanish garrison. The battle that followed was brief and catastrophic. The Irish attack collapsed, the Spanish surrendered, and the last serious possibility of reversing English power died on that frozen December morning. O'Neill held out for 2 more years, but the end was inevitable. He submitted in 1603, just days after Elizabeth herself had died, without ever knowing. The terms were generous by the standards of the age, but the war had cost Ireland a scale of destruction comparable to the worst of medieval catastrophe. The Gaelic order that had survived conquest, plantation, and reformation had finally broken. What would follow in Ulster would exceed even the Munster plantation in its ambition and its consequences, reshaping the north of Ireland in ways the world still lives with today. On the morning of September the 14th, 1607, a ship slipped quietly out of Lough Swilly from the small pier at Rathmullen in County Donegal. Aboard were Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and Rory O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, along with nearly 100 followers, relatives, and attendants. They were leaving Ireland forever. No one fully understood it at the time. The earls had told almost nobody. They simply sailed away into the Atlantic, bound eventually for the Spanish Netherlands, carrying with them the last living remnants of the old Gaelic aristocracy. O'Neill would die in Rome 9 years later, an elderly exile dependent on Spanish charity, never seeing Ireland again. The English administration in Dublin could scarcely believe its luck. O'Neill's submission after Kinsale had left him legally intact but politically neutered, watched and constrained at every turn. His flight, however, was treated as treason. And treason meant forfeiture. Within months, the English crown had confiscated roughly 4 million acres across 6 Ulster counties, an expanse covering most of what is now Northern Ireland. The land was declared crown property, and a plan emerged that would fundamentally and permanently alter the human geography of the island. The Plantation of Ulster, formally organized from 1610 onward, was the most ambitious colonization project Britain had yet attempted anywhere. The 6 confiscated counties, Armagh, Cavan, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Coleraine, and Donegal, were surveyed, divided, and distributed to new owners called undertakers. These men, mostly Scottish and English Protestant landowners, received their grants on strict conditions. They were required to build fortified houses and bawn walls, and critically, they were forbidden from renting land to native Irish tenants. They had to settle with Protestant colonists from Britain. What followed was a migration on a scale Ireland had never seen. Over the following decades, tens of thousands of Scottish Presbyterians crossed the narrow waters from Ayrshire and Galloway, where the Irish coast was visible on clear days. English settlers arrived from the border counties and further afield. By 1640, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 British settlers had established themselves across Ulster, bringing their language, their faith, their farming methods, and their deep suspicion of the Catholic population that remained all around them. The native Irish did not disappear. They could not be removed entirely. Instead, they were pushed to marginal land, the boggy uplands and rocky hillsides unsuitable for profitable farming, while the richer lowland soils passed to the newcomers. 2 communities now occupied the same province but inhabited entirely different worlds. The new plantation required new towns. The most significant was built on the site of the old Irish settlement of Dwar on the banks of the River Foyle. The project was assigned to the wealthy trade guilds of the City of London, who invested heavily and gave the new settlement the name it still carries today, Londonderry. Its walls, completed around 1619, were the finest example of planned urban fortification in the British Isles, a perfect circuit of stone enclosing a grid of Protestant streets. Other plantation towns rose across the province: Dungannon, Enniskillen, Coleraine, each a small fortress of the new order. What had the plantation created? A society split not merely by wealth or class, but by religion, by origin, by memory. The settlers knew they were surrounded. The native Irish knew they had been dispossessed. Each community told itself a story of grievance, and both stories contained enough truth to sustain the telling across generations. The Gaelic lords who remained, those too minor to have fled, found themselves tenants on land their families had held for centuries. The resentment that accumulated through the 1630s was volcanic in its pressure, requiring only the right moment to erupt. That moment came in October of 1641, when Ulster rose in a rebellion that would shake the entire archipelago and unleash a violence beyond anything the plantation's designers had imagined. The world they had so carefully constructed was about to be consumed by the fires their own actions had lit. The fires came in the night. On October the 23rd, 1641, Catholic Irish gentry and dispossessed landowners across Ulster rose simultaneously against the Protestant settler communities that had displaced them over the previous 3 decades. The signal had been carefully planned by Phelim O'Neill, a Gaelic lord from Tyrone, and his co-conspirators. What followed was neither clean nor controlled. In the weeks after the rising began, settler families were expelled from their homes across Ulster in the cold autumn rains. Many were stripped of their clothing, their livestock taken, their houses burned. Thousands died, though not all by the sword. Driven out onto the roads in November and December, many perished from exposure and starvation. At Portadown in County Armagh, somewhere between 100 and 150 Protestant settlers were herded onto a bridge over the river Bann and forced into the freezing water below. Those who tried to swim were beaten back until they drowned. How many died in total? Contemporary Protestant accounts claimed figures of extraordinary scale, some putting the death toll at 200,000 or even higher, numbers that exceeded the entire settler population of the island. Parliament in London received these testimonies, collected in a massive archive of depositions taken from survivors, and publicized them widely. The propaganda value was immense. Every atrocity, real or embellished, was catalogued and circulated to a horrified English public. The figure of 150,000 Protestant dead became fixed in the popular imagination, repeated in pamphlets and sermons for generations. Modern historians estimate the actual death toll at between 4,000 and 12,000, a genuine horror made mythological by political need. The rebellion rapidly transformed into something larger and more structured. By the spring of 1642, Catholic Ireland had organized itself into the Catholic Confederation of Kilkenny, a remarkable political experiment that amounted to a shadow government. Meeting in the medieval city on the River Nore, the Confederation issued its own currency, maintained its own armies, and pursued its own diplomacy with France, Spain, and the papacy. Its seal declared simply, in Latin, that it united for God, King, and Ireland. Yet the Confederation was never truly united. A profound fault line ran through its leadership between those who would accept a settlement restoring Catholic rights under the English crown and those who wanted genuine Irish sovereignty. The papal nuncio, Giovanni Battista Rinuccini, who arrived in 1645 bearing money and arms from Rome, pushed relentlessly for the harder line, fracturing coalitions at the moments they were most needed. Meanwhile, the conflict had merged entirely with the wider wars of the three kingdoms engulfing England and Scotland. The English Parliament and the King both sought Irish military support. Scottish Covenanter armies landed in Ulster. Confederate forces fought not one enemy but several, shifting alliances making coherent strategy nearly impossible. By 1649, the wars had consumed most of Ireland and left a landscape of famine, plague, and exhaustion. Entire counties had been depopulated. The Confederation had failed to achieve either of its possible goals. And across the water, events had reached a stunning conclusion. King Charles I had been tried and executed in January of 1649, and England was now a republic governed by men who had not forgotten a single word of those depositions from Ulster. Oliver Cromwell was already preparing his ships. He arrived at Dublin on the 15th of August 1649 with an army of 12,000 veteran soldiers, battle-hardened from the civil wars, and a righteous fury that had been building for 8 years. Oliver Cromwell stepped onto Irish soil carrying the weight of every Protestant deposition, every pulpit sermon, every pamphlet account of Portadown. In his mind, what he had come to do was not conquest. It was justice. Drogheda was first. The town on the River Boyne was garrisoned by some 2,800 Royalist and Irish troops under Sir Arthur Aston, an English Catholic commander who believed the walls would hold. On the 11th of September, after Cromwell's artillery opened the southern wall, parliamentary forces poured through the breach. Aston was beaten to death with his own wooden leg. What followed lasted for 3 days. Cromwell's soldiers killed not only the garrison but Catholic clergy sheltering in the town, and by most accounts civilians as well. Estimates of the dead range up to 3,500. Those soldiers who survived the initial slaughter were shipped to Barbados as forced labor. Cromwell wrote to Parliament describing the massacre as a righteous judgment of God upon barbarous wretches. He was not troubled by what he had done. Wexford fell in October. There, the killing was less ordered but no less lethal. As negotiations for surrender were still technically ongoing, Cromwell's troops stormed the town and roughly 2,000 people, soldiers and civilians combined, were cut down in the streets and along the quays. The marketplace ran red. The town that had been one of Ireland's busiest ports was left so devastated it would take a generation to recover. By the time the military campaign ground toward its conclusion in 1652, Ireland had been broken. Plague and famine, the twin companions of prolonged war, had done nearly as much damage as the army itself. Contemporary estimates, inevitably uncertain, suggest the island may have lost as much as a fifth of its entire population in the space of a decade. Then came the settlement, and for many historians, this is where the deepest wound was made. The Act for the Settlement of Ireland in 1652 transferred land on a scale that dwarfed even the plantations of the previous century. Catholic landowners across Leinster, Munster, and Ulster faced a brutal choice: surrender their estates or be transplanted west of the Shannon into the rocky, thin-soiled province of Connacht. The phrase attached to this policy became one of the most enduring epithets in Irish history: to hell or to Connacht. The numbers tell their own story. Before 1641, Catholics had owned roughly 60% of Irish land. By 1660, that figure had collapsed to 22%. The remainder had been redistributed to parliamentary soldiers paid in land grants rather than wages, to London merchants who had financed the conquest, and to a new Protestant landowning class that would shape Ireland's social structure for the next 2 centuries. Cromwell himself left Ireland in May 1650, handing command to his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and returned to England, where other matters demanded his attention. He never came back, but his name remained in Ireland as a synonym for calculated devastation. Generations of Irish children would be taught to bless themselves at the mention of it. The Cromwellian land settlement did not simply redistribute property. It created a divided island, one in which religion and land ownership had become inseparable, where Catholic and Protestant stood not merely as theological categories but as economic ones. That division, hardened into law and landscape alike, would outlast the Cromwellian Republic itself, surviving the restoration of the monarchy and enduring long into the centuries ahead. 30 years after Cromwell's soldiers carved their settlement into Irish soil, Europe's great religious war arrived on Irish shores one final time. The man who brought it there was a king without a kingdom, desperate and diminished, but still wearing a crown. James II had lost his English throne in the winter of 1688. His Protestant son-in-law William of Orange had sailed from the Netherlands with an army, and James's own generals had melted away. He fled to France, where Louis XIV offered sympathy, money, and a plan. Ireland, still largely Catholic, still smoldering with resentment against the Cromwellian settlement, seemed the obvious place to begin reclaiming what had been lost. James landed at Kinsale in March 1689. The crowds who greeted him were not greeting him precisely. They were greeting the possibility of reversal, the chance that the land transfers of the previous generation might finally be undone. But even as James moved through a largely welcoming island, one city refused to open its gates. Derry, a Protestant and predominantly settler city on the northern coast, had been garrisoned by apprentice boys who slammed the gates shut against a Jacobite regiment in December 1688. The siege that followed lasted 105 days. Inside the walls, the population starved. Dogs, cats, rats, and boiled leather were consumed before relief finally came in July 1689, when English ships broke through the boom across the River Foyle. Roughly 10,000 of Derry's defenders are believed to have perished from starvation and disease. The siege became the founding myth of Ulster Protestant identity, and its memory has never fully faded. The decisive moment came the following summer. William of Orange crossed to Ireland himself, commanding an army of around 36,000 men drawn from across Protestant Europe, Dutch, Danish, French Huguenots, and English. James met him with approximately 25,000. On the 1st of July, 1690, the two armies faced each other across the River Boyne, just north of Drogheda, within sight of the same ground where Cromwell had broken through 40 years before. The battle lasted a single day. William's forces crossed the river at multiple points, flanking the Jacobite position. James watched from a hillside, and when it became clear the line was breaking, he fled. He left Ireland within days and never returned. His Irish supporters, abandoned, would fight on for another year. The war contracted to its final point at Limerick. Twice the city was besieged, and twice it held. The second siege, in the autumn of 1691, ended not with walls collapsing, but with negotiation. The Treaty of Limerick, signed in October 1691, promised Irish Catholics a degree of religious toleration and allowed Jacobite soldiers to depart with their honor intact. The promise, like so many before it, would not be kept. Approximately 12,000 Irish soldiers sailed for France under Patrick Sarsfield rather than submit to Williamite rule. They became the Wild Geese, the first wave of an Irish military diaspora that would serve in the armies of France, Spain, and Austria across the coming century. They carried Ireland into European wars, but Ireland itself they would not see again. What they left behind was a country poised to be locked more tightly than ever beneath Protestant control. The English Parliament in Dublin would soon translate victory into law, drafting a new architecture of exclusion that would press down on Catholic Ireland for generations to come. The ink on the Treaty of Limerick was barely dry before the promises it contained began to dissolve. The Irish Parliament in Dublin, overwhelmingly Protestant and deeply suspicious of any concession to the Catholic majority, simply refused to ratify its key provisions. What had been guaranteed at the negotiating table was denied in the chamber. And from that act of deliberate betrayal, an entire architecture of oppression would rise. Beginning in the 1690s and continuing through the first decades of the 1700s, the Irish Parliament enacted a series of statutes that history knows collectively as the penal laws. No single dramatic decree announced the new order. Instead, it arrived clause by clause, year by year, each law tightening the grip a little further. Catholics were barred from sitting in Parliament, from holding public office, from serving as lawyers or judges, from carrying arms, and from owning a horse worth more than £5. The inheritance laws were deliberately designed to fracture Catholic estates. If a Catholic landowner died, his land could not pass intact to his eldest son, but had to be divided equally among all his children, unless one converted to Protestantism, in which case that child could claim the entire inheritance. Families were set against themselves. The law became a slow-moving machine for transferring Catholic wealth into Protestant hands. By 1778, when the first modest relaxations began, Catholics who had once owned the majority of Irish land held barely 5% of it. Education was its own battlefield. Catholic schools were banned. Catholic clergy were officially outlawed from the country, though in practice they survived in hiding, hunted by informers who could claim a bounty for reporting a priest. To educate a Catholic child abroad was illegal. The intent was unmistakable. A people denied clergy, denied schooling, denied any formal transmission of their culture and faith, would eventually cease to be a people at all. They did not cease. They adapted. Across Ireland, in fields and along ditches and behind hedgerows, a parallel educational system took shape. The hedge schools, as they became known, gathered children around teachers who worked for whatever payment a poor community could spare: a handful of oats, a night's shelter, a coin if one existed. Latin was taught in the open air. Mathematics was scratched in mud. History was spoken aloud because writing it down was dangerous. The teachers moved constantly, and so did the lessons. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary act of collective resistance. A conquered people, stripped of almost every formal institution, found a way to keep knowledge alive by making knowledge invisible. Meanwhile, those who had inherited Ireland's ruling position built their world with confidence and some considerable grandeur. The Protestant ascendancy, as this class came to be called, constructed the great Georgian townhouses of Dublin, laid out its wide streets and elegant squares, filled its libraries with Enlightenment philosophy. Trinity College flourished as an intellectual center, though no Catholic could attend. The contrast between this polished world and the hidden ditches where Catholic children learned their letters was total, and it was entirely intentional. What the penal laws created was not, in the end, the erasure of Catholic Ireland. They created something their architects had not anticipated: a Catholic identity fused permanently with a sense of dispossession, of endurance under injustice, of survival against deliberate destruction. That identity would prove more durable than the laws themselves. By the 1770s, pressure from unexpected directions, including Ireland's Protestant dissenters, who faced their own restrictions, and the broader currents of Enlightenment reform sweeping Europe, would begin to loosen the grip. But the damage of those 8 decades had already settled deep into the ground of Irish life, and the harvest it produced was still to come. The news from America arrived in Ireland like a stone dropped into still water. By 1776, the ripples were reaching every corner of the island. If colonists could argue that taxation without representation was tyranny, what exactly did that make British rule over Ireland? Protestant Irishmen, men of property and education, who had never questioned their loyalty to the crown, found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. The timing was fortunate, or depending on one's perspective, catastrophic for British interests. War with America, and then with France and Spain, stretched British military resources to breaking point. The troops normally garrisoned in Ireland were shipped across the Atlantic. The island was left largely undefended. Into that vacuum stepped the Irish volunteers. What began in 1778 as a practical response to genuine invasion anxiety became something far more interesting. Across Ireland, Protestant gentlemen organized themselves into armed companies, drilled in public squares, and paraded in uniforms of their own choosing and funding. By 1780, somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 men were bearing arms under volunteer banners. The British government, needing Irish goodwill and lacking any means to compel it, watched with growing unease. Henry Grattan understood the moment precisely. A brilliant Dublin lawyer and parliamentarian of fierce eloquence, he articulated a vision that was radical for its time. Ireland, he argued, was a kingdom in its own right, with its own parliament, and that parliament had no business being subordinate to Westminster. The constitutional restrictions imposed by Poyning's Law in 1494, which required all Irish legislation to be approved in London first, were an insult to a free people. The volunteers gave those words a military dimension that mere speech-making never could. In 1782, with armed men drilling across the country and Grattan's oratory echoing through College Green, Westminster conceded. Poyning's Law was effectively suspended. The Irish Parliament gained a right to legislate independently. Grattan stood in the Dublin Parliament and declared that Ireland was now a nation. It was, for a brief season, intoxicating. But the clarity of the victory masked its limitations. The Parliament on College Green remained entirely Protestant. Catholics, despite modest relief measures passed in 1778 and 1782, could not sit within it. The franchise was narrow, the borough system was corrupt, and much of the membership was quietly in the pocket of British-connected interests. Grattan's parliament was independent in theory and compromised in practice. More troubling still, the idealism that had united Protestant patriots in 1780 began to fragment almost immediately once the prize was won. Without a common enemy, the volunteer movement drifted. Grattan's attempts to push further to reform the parliament itself and extend genuine rights to Catholics met resistance from men who had been radicals enough to challenge London, but were not radical enough to share power with their Catholic neighbors. The glittering moment was already tarnishing, and across the Atlantic, a revolution had ended. But across the Channel in France, another was about to begin. The revolution that erupted in France in 1789 did not stay in France. Its ideas moved faster than any army, crossing the Channel and the Irish Sea, igniting imaginations wherever men felt the weight of unjust power. In Ireland, one man felt that ignition more intensely than almost anyone else. Theobald Wolfe Tone was a Dublin Protestant lawyer, sharp-minded and restless, unimpressed by the half-measures of Grattan's generation. What Ireland needed, he believed, was not a reformed parliament but no British connection at all. And to achieve that, he proposed something genuinely revolutionary for his time, that Catholic and Protestant and dissenter must unite as Irishmen and set their religious differences aside entirely. In 1791, in Belfast, Tone helped found the Society of United Irishmen. The name carried its entire program within it. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed possible. Presbyterian merchants in Belfast and Catholic tenant farmers in Munster found common cause in the language of liberty, equality, and national independence that was pouring out of Paris. The British government was not inclined to wait and see how the experiment concluded. By 1794, the United Irishmen were suppressed as a legal organization. They went underground, and underground they grew more radical, more conspiratorial, and more desperate. Tone himself sailed for France, seeking what every Irish rebel before him had sought: foreign intervention. He nearly got it. In December of 1796, a French fleet of 43 ships carrying nearly 15,000 troops reached Bantry Bay on Ireland's southwestern coast. The British garrison was wholly inadequate to resist such a force. But the weather intervened where British arms could not. Ferocious Atlantic storms scattered the fleet and prevented any landing. Tone stood on the deck of his ship within sight of the Irish shore and could not reach it. The closest Ireland would come to liberation, he later wrote, was almost within touching distance. The rebellion, when it finally came in May of 1798, came without French support and under the shadow of prior government infiltration. What followed was less a coordinated uprising than a series of desperate regional explosions, the most significant of which erupted in County Wexford. For several weeks, a rebel army led in part by Catholic priests held the southeast, winning early engagements through sheer numbers and ferocity. The name Vinegar Hill, where 20,000 rebels made their stand in June, would pass into Irish memory as a symbol of both courage and catastrophe. British forces under General Lake broke them there with cannon fire. The suppression was extraordinary in its brutality. Loyalist militias and British troops moved through rebel areas with a savagery that shocked even some British observers. Estimates of the dead across the whole rebellion reach as high as 30,000 people, many of them civilians who never lifted a pike. In August, French troops under General Humbert finally landed at Killala Bay in County Mayo, months too late and thousands of men too few. They won a remarkable victory at Castlebar before being surrounded and forced to surrender. A second French expedition, carrying Tone himself, was intercepted at sea in October. Tone was taken prisoner, tried for treason in Dublin, and condemned to death. He was found in his cell in November of 1798 with a severed throat, the wound inflicted by his own hand before the hangman could reach him. The rebellion was over. 30,000 were dead. Its leader was gone. And Britain now had precisely the argument it had been waiting for, that Ireland's separate parliament was a dangerous luxury that could no longer be permitted. The rebellion's ashes were still cooling when William Pitt the Younger moved to make permanent what force had only temporarily secured. Ireland's separate parliament, he had concluded, was simply too dangerous to leave standing. The solution was absorption, a full legislative union that would bind Ireland to Britain as Scotland had been bound a century before. Pitt knew the Irish Parliament would not vote itself out of existence willingly. So he purchased its compliance. Peerages, pensions, and outright cash payments flowed to parliamentarians in quantities that astonished even the cynical standards of the age. Constituencies were bought. Votes were counted before they were cast. When the Act of Union finally passed on August 1st, 1800, it did so through one of the most systematic exercises in political corruption that British history has ever recorded. On January 1st, 1801, the Parliament in Dublin fell silent. 100 Irish members took their seats at Westminster instead, a token presence in an assembly of over 600. Ireland was now, in law, part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. For those who had fought and died under the green flags of the United Irishmen, the Union was not a settlement. It was a burial. Pitt had made one promise to smooth the transition through. Catholic emancipation, the right of Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold high office, would follow the Union as a matter of course. It seemed a reasonable bargain. It was immediately broken. King George III declared that granting such rights would violate his coronation oath to defend the Protestant Constitution. Pitt, unable to move the king, resigned. The promise dissolved before the ink on the Union was dry. Into this atmosphere of betrayal stepped a young man who would not survive the decade. Robert Emmet, 25 years old and burning with idealism, organized a small uprising in Dublin in July 1803. It collapsed almost before it began, descending into street violence that killed the Lord Chief Justice, among others. Emmet was captured, tried, and hanged in September. But at his trial, he delivered a speech from the dock that would outlast every setback of his short life. "When my country takes her place among the nations of the earth," he declared, "then, and not till then, let my epitaph be written." Ireland heard him and remembered. The man who would eventually write that epitaph in his own way was a Kerry-born Catholic lawyer of extraordinary gifts named Daniel O'Connell. Where Emmet had chosen the pike, O'Connell chose the platform. Through his Catholic Association, founded in 1823, he organized something entirely new. A mass democratic movement funded by a penny-a-month subscription that even the poorest tenant farmer could afford. Hundreds of thousands joined. The Catholic clergy mobilized their parishes behind him. Britain had never encountered political organization on this scale before. The crisis came in 1828 when O'Connell stood for election in County Clare. He won decisively. He was legally barred from taking his seat as a Catholic. But the alternative was plain to the Duke of Wellington and his government in London: grant emancipation or face an Ireland on the edge of open rebellion, organized not by a handful of conspirators but by millions. Wellington, the man who had defeated Napoleon, recognized a battle he could not win. The Catholic Emancipation Act passed in April 1829. O'Connell took his seat. Ireland, for the first time since the 17th century, had won a political victory through constitutional means, through votes and voices rather than blood and fire. It was a triumph. It was also, though few fully understood it yet, a lesson in the limits of what moral force alone could ultimately extract from an imperial parliament. The deeper questions of land and sovereignty remained entirely untouched, waiting for the catastrophe that was already approaching. The Catholic emancipation victory of 1829 had proven something remarkable. That organized mass pressure could bend the British Parliament. O'Connell drew exactly the lesson one might expect. If a movement of hundreds of thousands could secure Catholic rights, then millions might yet dissolve the Union itself. He called it Repeal, and through the 1830s and into the 1840s, he built toward it with the same genius for popular mobilization he had shown before. The year 1843 became his moment of peak ambition. Across Ireland, O'Connell staged what newspapers called the monster meetings, vast open-air gatherings that strained comprehension. At Tara, the ancient hill of Irish kings, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people assembled on a single August afternoon. The fields turned human as far as the eye could see, a sea of faces stretching toward every horizon. O'Connell stood among them and spoke of Ireland's destiny in language that made the ground feel like sacred territory. For one extraordinary summer, it seemed as though sheer numbers might accomplish what armies had failed to do. Then came Clontarf. The government of Robert Peel had watched the monster meetings with growing alarm. When O'Connell announced a gathering at Clontarf outside Dublin for October 8, 1843, Peel moved decisively. Troops surrounded the site. The meeting was banned on the eve of its assembly when thousands were already converging on the city. O'Connell, unwilling to see blood spilled, canceled it. He chose his principles over his momentum, and his movement never recovered. He was subsequently arrested, tried for conspiracy, and briefly imprisoned. Though the House of Lords overturned the conviction, something essential had broken. The strategic question hung unanswered in the air. What happens when moral force is simply refused? O'Connell never found an answer. Aged, diminished, and increasingly baffled by the catastrophe of the famine unfolding around him, he died in Genoa in May 1847, traveling toward Rome. His heart was sent to the Vatican. His body returned to Ireland. A movement searching for direction buried him. Watching O'Connell's decline was a younger generation who had drawn a different conclusion from Clontarf. The Young Irelanders, gathering around the newspaper The Nation, founded in 1842, believed that cultural identity and, if necessary, physical force were the true foundations of national freedom. Thomas Davis, John Mitchell, and William Smith O'Brien represented a broader coalition, crossing religious lines in ways O'Connell's movement rarely had. When the famine ravaged the countryside and British food exports continued, Mitchell's fury became incandescent. His newspaper, the United Irishmen, demanded revolution openly. In July 1848, with Europe ablaze with liberal uprisings, the Young Irelanders raised their rebellion in County Tipperary. It collapsed almost immediately. A brief skirmish in a cabbage garden at Ballingarry that history records with more embarrassment than glory. Its leaders were transported to Australia. Two traditions now stood divided: the constitutional and the revolutionary. That division would shape Irish nationalism for generations to come. The blight arrived without warning, without fanfare, without any of the drama one might expect from a catastrophe of such magnitude. In the autumn of 1845, farmers across Ireland walked into their fields to find the potato plants blackened, the air thick with a sickly sweet rot. The culprit was Phytophthora infestans, a water mold traveling west from continental Europe, and it had found in Ireland's damp climate a perfect home. For a population in which perhaps 3 million of the poorest people depended almost entirely on the potato for sustenance, this was not an agricultural problem. It was a death sentence written in soil. The 1845 failure was partial. Terrible, but survivable. 1846 was not. The second consecutive total crop failure sent hunger cascading into famine with terrifying speed. Then came what the Irish would simply call Black 47, a winter of such suffering that it passed into the language as its own category of horror. People died in ditches. They died in their cottages, whole families together, their mouths sometimes stained green from eating grass. An estimated 1 million people perished between 1845 and 1852. And yet, throughout these years, food continued to leave Ireland. This is the fact that stops every honest account cold. While the Irish starved, ships carried oats, cattle, butter, and barley out of Irish ports to Britain. The exports were not enormous by some measures, but their symbolic and moral weight was crushing. Ireland was a food-producing country. The famine was not an absence of food. It was an absence of food that the poor could afford to eat. The man who most embodied British policy was Charles Edward Trevelyan, the Treasury official who oversaw famine relief. Trevelyan was not a monster in any conventional sense. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a true believer. He held with fierce conviction to the laissez-faire economic orthodoxy of his age, which taught that government interference in markets caused more harm than good, that the market would correct itself, and that charity corrupted its recipients. He also, at moments, described the famine as a divine judgment on Irish improvidence. When the second catastrophic failure arrived in 1846, Trevelyan wound down the public works schemes that had barely sustained life, and replaced them with a workhouse system already collapsing under impossible weight. Families surrendered their homes to enter the workhouses, since holding more than a quarter acre of land made them ineligible for relief. The system selected with bureaucratic precision for maximum humiliation. What did survival look like for those who could manage it? It looked like a ship. Between 1845 and 1852, approximately 1 million people fled Ireland. They booked passage on whatever vessels would take them, many heading for North America. The ships were overcrowded, undersupplied, and frequently disease-ridden. So many passengers died in transit that the vessels acquired a name still used today: coffin ships. The Erin's Queen, the Larch, the Virginius, these were not exceptional cases. Mortality rates on some crossings exceeded 30%. Those who survived arrived in Boston, New York, Montreal, and Liverpool as refugees, carrying with them hunger, grief, and a fury toward Britain that would not cool for generations. The numbers record what words struggle to contain. Ireland's population stood at approximately 8.2 million before the famine. By 1852, it had fallen to 6.6 million, and it would continue falling for decades. No other country in Europe experienced demographic collapse on this scale in peacetime. The Great Famine did not merely kill people. It transformed Irish identity, Irish politics, and Irish-Britain relations in ways that no act of Parliament could undo. The Irish diaspora, scattered across America, Australia, and beyond, carried its inheritance with them, a memory of abandonment, a suspicion of British intentions that Trevelyan's reports and Westminster's indifference had fully earned. In the decades that followed, that diaspora would fund, arm, and inspire a new generation of revolutionaries. The hunger would not stay buried. It would come looking for answers. The hunger did come looking for answers. And it found them, first in the barrel of a gun. In 1858, two organizations rose almost simultaneously on either side of the Atlantic. In Dublin, James Stephens founded the Irish Republican Brotherhood. In New York, John O'Mahony established its American mirror, the Fenian Brotherhood. Funded by immigrant dollars and powered by famine memory, these were men who had drawn a clean conclusion from the preceding decade. Britain would never willingly surrender Ireland, and constitutional agitation had proven worse than useless. Only physical force would do. Their rising, when it came in 1867, was a military failure. Poorly coordinated, riddled with informers, crushed within days. But the Fenians did something more durable than win battles. They kept the flame of separatist republicanism burning, passed it forward, and planted in the diaspora a deep willingness to pay for whatever came next. The gunmen had failed. The politicians were about to try. Michael Davitt came from a family evicted during the famine clearances, had worked in an English mill as a child, lost his arm to factory machinery at age 11, and served 7 years in prison for gun running. By 1879, this slight, intense man had concluded that Ireland's deepest wound was not political but economic. The land itself was the question. 3/4 of Irish soil was owned by roughly 10,000 landlords, many of them absentees who had never set foot on the estates, draining rent from families still recovering from catastrophe. In October 1879, Davitt founded the Irish National Land League. Its demands were rent reductions, security of tenure, and ultimately peasant ownership of the land the Irish worked. The agitation that followed was unlike anything Britain had managed in Ireland before. When a County Mayo land agent named Charles Boycott refused to reduce rents in 1880, his tenants simply refused to deal with him. They would not harvest his crops, deliver his mail, or sell him goods. His name entered the English language within months as the word for exactly that tactic, a boycott. Alongside Davitt stood a figure of entirely different origins and entirely complementary genius. Charles Stuart Parnell was Protestant, Anglo-Irish, the son of a Wicklow landlord. He was also the most formidable parliamentary operator Ireland had ever produced. Taking over leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party, Parnell transformed a loose collection of MPs into a disciplined bloc that could obstruct, delay, and pressure Westminster with mechanical efficiency. He spoke rarely but with devastating precision. He understood leverage. And he forced William Gladstone, Britain's Liberal Prime Minister and its greatest political mind, to take Home Rule seriously for the first time. By 1886, Gladstone introduced a Home Rule bill in Parliament. It failed, splitting his own party, but the fact of its introduction marked a revolution in British political thinking. An Irish Parliament in Dublin was no longer an abstraction. It was a live question. Then came Captain William O'Shea. In November 1890, O'Shea filed for divorce from his wife Catherine, naming Parnell as co-respondent. The affair had in fact continued for nearly a decade, producing 3 children. Parnell had made no secret of it within political circles. But its exposure was catastrophic. Gladstone, facing pressure from nonconformist liberal voters who found the scandal intolerable, withdrew his support. The Irish Catholic bishops turned against their most powerful ally. Parnell's own party fractured bitterly. He fought on with furious energy, campaigning across Ireland in winter rain until his health collapsed entirely. He died in Brighton in October 1891. He was 45 years old. Ireland mourned him with a grief indistinguishable from rage. The man who had brought Home Rule within reach was gone. But the idea he had carried would not die so easily. Parnell was dead, but the question he had carried lived on. It would take another generation to bring it to the point of crisis, and when it arrived with rifles. In April 1912, Herbert Asquith's Liberal government introduced the Third Home Rule Bill in the House of Commons. After 2 previous failures spanning nearly 3 decades, the political conditions had finally aligned. The Parliament Act of 1911 had stripped the House of Lords of its absolute veto, meaning Irish home rule could no longer be indefinitely blocked by the Anglo-Irish aristocrats who packed the upper chamber. A modest Irish parliament in Dublin, managing domestic affairs while Westminster retained control of foreign policy and defense, seemed at last within reach. For Irish nationalists, it felt like the fulfillment of everything Parnell had suffered for. Ulster Protestants saw something else entirely. They saw encirclement. They saw Catholic domination. They saw the systematic dismantling of their identity, their commerce, their connection to a British crown they considered their own. The industrial heartland of Belfast, with its shipyards and linen mills, looked at rural Catholic Ireland and saw a different country, not a home. Their answer was Edward Carson, a brilliant Dublin-born barrister who had destroyed Oscar Wilde in the witness box. Carson became the voice of Ulster's resistance with a ferocity that electrified crowds. In September 1912, nearly 500,000 Ulster men and women signed the Ulster Covenant, pledging to use all means which may be found necessary to resist home rule. Some signed in their own blood. The language was not metaphorical. The Ulster Volunteer Force followed in January 1913, an armed militia eventually numbering nearly 100,000 men, drilling openly in the northern countryside. Britain watched, largely paralyzed. Could the government suppress loyal subjects defending their Britishness with the same imperial self-confidence it suppressed Irish nationalism? The answer, as events would show, was no. The South responded in kind. In November 1913, the Irish Volunteers formed in Dublin, a nationalist counterpart explicitly created to ensure home rule would be delivered rather than blocked. Ireland now had two private armies facing each other across a sectarian line. Then came the guns. In April 1914, the Ulster Volunteer Force landed 25,000 rifles at the port of Larne in a meticulously organized overnight operation, dispersing weapons across Ulster before authorities could respond. 3 months later, Irish volunteers landed their own shipment at Howth, north of Dublin. When British troops attempted to intercept them, crowds jeered and scuffled. The soldiers later fired on civilians at Bachelor's Walk in Dublin, killing 3. The contrast in official responses enraged nationalists across the country. By the summer of 1914, Ireland stood closer to civil war than at any point since the 17th century. Westminster scrambled desperately for a compromise, some partition arrangement that might satisfy Ulster without abandoning Southern nationalists entirely. Then, on the 28th of June 1914, a young man in Sarajevo fired 2 shots, and the world had larger problems. The war that swallowed Europe in August 1914 also swallowed the Irish crisis, at least temporarily. Home rule passed into law in September, then was immediately suspended for the duration of the conflict. John Redmond, leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, urged his volunteers to enlist and fight for Britain, believing loyalty would be rewarded with full implementation when peace came. Hundreds of thousands of Irishmen did exactly that, dying in the mud of Flanders for a freedom they hoped was waiting at home. But not everyone was willing to wait. And not everyone believed Britain would ever willingly let Ireland go. Patrick Pearse was a schoolteacher, a poet, and a man who had come to believe that Ireland could only be reborn through blood. His writings spoke of sacrifice in almost mystical terms, of a generation that must offer itself so that the nation might live. James Connolly was something different entirely, a labor organizer and committed socialist who had watched Dublin's poor suffer through the brutal lockout of 1913, and concluded that capitalism and British imperialism were the same enemy wearing different coats. Between them, and alongside the Irish Republican Brotherhood working in secret for years, they assembled something both visionary and desperate. They knew they could not win militarily. They had perhaps 1,600 men committed to the rising in Dublin against the full weight of the British Army. A shipment of German rifles, 20,000 of them aboard the Odd, was intercepted and scuttled by its own captain before it could reach Kerry. The planned nationwide rising shrank to a Dublin action. And still they went ahead. Easter Monday, April the 24th, 1916. A bank holiday, the city unhurried, the streets carrying their usual holiday crowd. Shortly after noon, a column of men and women in green uniforms marched to the General Post Office on Sackville Street. Within minutes they had seized it. Pierce stepped outside and read aloud the proclamation of the Irish Republic, declaring sovereignty in the name of the Irish people and the dead generations. Curious onlookers watched. Some jeered. Others wept. For 6 days, Dublin burned. The British response was overwhelming, artillery turning the center of the city into rubble, gunboats on the Liffey shelling rebel positions. By Saturday the 29th, Pierce had ordered an unconditional surrender to prevent further civilian deaths. Perhaps 500 people had died, many of them ordinary Dubliners caught in the crossfire. The rising seemed finished. Prisoners were marched through the streets to jeers from a public angry at the destruction and the grief. Then Britain made the decision that changed everything. Between the 3rd and 12th of May, the British government executed 15 of the rising's leaders in Kilmainham and Gaol, one each morning by firing squad. Pierce, Connolly, the signatories of the proclamation, gone one by one over 10 slow, terrible days. Connolly, badly wounded and unable to stand, was tied to a chair to be shot. The public that had jeered the prisoners began to go quiet. Then it began to turn. Something about the relentless drip of executions, the clinical patience of it, reached somewhere the rising itself had not. Grief hardened into fury. The men who had seemed like reckless adventurers became martyrs, and martyrs are far more dangerous than soldiers. Pierce had understood this. He had written about it. The blood sacrifice freely offered would fertilize the ground for the Republic to grow. He was not wrong. The executions did not end the Irish question. They transformed it, sweeping away the moderate politics of Redmond's generation and opening the door to something far more uncompromising. The next chapter would not be fought with proclamations. The elections of December 1918 told the story plainly. Sinn Féin, the Republican Party that had absorbed the energy of the executed martyrs, won 73 seats in the British Parliament. They refused to go to Westminster. Instead, in January 1919, they assembled in Dublin as the First Dáil, declaring themselves the Parliament of an independent Irish Republic. On the same day, almost as if to underscore what was coming, 2 Royal Irish Constabulary officers were shot dead in Tipperary. The war had already begun before anyone had formally declared it. Its architect was a Cork man named Michael Collins, 30 years old, restless, brilliant, and utterly without sentiment about what needed to be done. Collins understood that the old model of open rebellion, of proclamations and held positions, would be crushed. Instead, he built something new, a network of flying columns and intelligence operatives that struck fast, melted back into the civilian population, and struck again. His men assassinated detectives, ambushed patrols, and systematically dismantled the British intelligence apparatus in Ireland. Britain's response was to unleash the Black and Tans, hastily recruited paramilitaries named for the mismatched uniforms they wore, and the auxiliaries' ex-officers just as brutal. They arrived in 1920 and within months had become the defining symbol of British rule. Villages were burned, civilians shot at roadblocks, reprisals carried out against communities suspected of sheltering rebels. In November 1920, Collins's men killed 14 British intelligence officers in a single morning. That afternoon, Black and Tans drove into Croke Park during a Gaelic football match and opened fire on the crowd, killing 14 civilians. Bloody Sunday. 3 weeks later, an IRA ambush killed 17 auxiliaries at Kilmichael in Cork. In retaliation, the auxiliaries burned much of Cork City's center to the ground. By the summer of 1921, neither side could win outright. A truce was called in July, and negotiations began in London. Collins went, famously reluctant, sensing the trap embedded in any deal Britain would accept. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed in December 1921, gave Ireland something and withheld something. The Irish Free State would have dominion status within the British Empire. Its politicians required to swear an oath of allegiance to the crown. And 6 counties in the northeast, where the Protestant Unionist majority was concentrated, would remain under British rule as Northern Ireland, already established under the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. Ireland would be partitioned. The question was whether these terms were a stepping stone or a surrender. Collins called the treaty a stepping stone. Eamon de Valera called it a betrayal. The Dáil voted to accept it, narrowly, in January 1922. De Valera walked out. What followed is still painful to speak of. By June 1922, the men who had fought together against the Black and Tans were pointing rifles at each other. The pro-treaty Free State forces against the anti-treaty IRA, former comrades, sometimes brothers. The Civil War lasted until May 1923, killing more Irish people than the War of Independence had. Collins himself did not survive it. He was killed in an ambush in his home county of Cork in August 1922, 31 years old. Whether the exact circumstances will ever be fully known remains an open question. The Civil War ended not with a peace treaty, but with exhaustion. The anti-treaty forces dumped their arms. The wounds did not heal for generations. Irish political parties formed around the fault lines of those years, carrying the grudges of 1922 into the 21st century. Ireland had won its freedom. But the price had been partition, civil war, and a bitterness that would shape everything that followed, including what was happening quietly and dangerously in the north. 2 states emerged from the wreckage of partition, separated by a border drawn in haste and destined to harden into something permanent. They would spend the next 4 decades turning away from each other, each becoming, in its own way, a world unto itself. In the South, Eamon de Valera got what he had walked out of the Dáil to fight for, eventually. He came to power democratically in 1932 and set about reshaping the Free State in his own image. His Constitution of 1937 was a document that told the world exactly what kind of country Ireland intended to be. It acknowledged the special position of the Catholic Church as guardian of the faith held by the great majority of citizens. Divorce was effectively prohibited. The family was defined in terms the Vatican would have recognized immediately. The state's territory was declared to encompass the whole island, a constitutional claim on the north that would remain in place for decades. The Republic was formally declared in 1949, cutting the last threads connecting Dublin to the Crown. But by then, the deeper character of Southern Ireland was already set. Conservative, rural, deeply clerical. The church ran the schools, the hospitals, and much of the moral architecture of daily life. Emigration drained the young and the restless, hundreds of thousands crossing to England and America in the 1940s and 50s, not fleeing persecution but simply fleeing a lack of prospects. Emigration became the safety valve that allowed the state to avoid confronting its own failures. Across the border, Northern Ireland presented a different face with a similar problem. From its creation in 1921 through to 1972, the Stormont Parliament was governed without interruption by the Ulster Unionist Party. One party, one community, one direction. The state was, as its first Prime Minister James Craig declared without embarrassment, a Protestant parliament for Protestant people. The Catholic minority, roughly 1/3 of the population, was managed rather than included. Gerrymandering carved electoral boundaries to dilute nationalist votes even in areas where Catholics formed the majority. In Derry, a city that was 2/3 Catholic, Unionists retained permanent control of the city council through careful manipulation of ward boundaries. Housing allocation followed the same logic, with Catholic families consistently passed over in favor of Protestant applicants. Law enforcement added another layer of exclusion. The B Specials, an almost entirely Protestant reserve constabulary, were notorious for their hostility toward Catholic communities. They were less a police force than an armed expression of the state's tribal loyalties. Emigration here too served as pressure release, with young Catholics leaving for England rather than remaining to contest a system that seemed immovable. Both states, then, used emigration to export their contradictions and postpone their reckonings. But reckonings, as history insists, cannot be postponed forever. In the North, a new generation was about to stop leaving and start demanding. That new generation arrived in 1968, and it arrived with placards rather than guns. Inspired by civil rights movements in America, young Catholics in Northern Ireland took to the streets demanding something almost modest in its simplicity: equal votes, fair housing, an end to discrimination. The marchers sang "We Shall Overcome." They expected to be heard. Instead, they were batoned off the streets. Television cameras captured Royal Ulster Constabulary officers beating peaceful demonstrators at Burntillet Bridge and in Derry. The footage shocked audiences across Britain and the world. What kind of state beat its own citizens for asking to be treated equally? The answer came quickly. By August 1969, Protestant mobs had burned Catholic streets in Belfast. The Battle of the Bogside saw Derry's nationalist residents holding their neighborhood against police assault for 3 days. The British Army arrived that same month, initially welcomed by Catholic families offering soldiers tea on their doorsteps. That welcome would not last. Everything changed on the 30th of January, 1972. On a cold Sunday afternoon in Derry, soldiers of the Parachute Regiment opened fire on unarmed civilians during a civil rights demonstration. 14 people were killed. The youngest was 17. None were armed. Bloody Sunday did not just shatter trust in British institutions. It recruited a generation to the Provisional IRA. The Provisionals, who had split from the IRA in 1969, now embarked on a campaign of bombings and shootings that would stretch across 3 decades. Loyalist paramilitaries answered with their own campaign of sectarian murder. Between them, with the British state caught in the middle and sometimes acting worse than either, over 3,500 people died before it was over. In 1981, the conflict found a face the world recognized. Bobby Sands, an IRA prisoner in the Maze prison, led a hunger strike demanding political status for Republican inmates. He was elected to the Westminster Parliament while refusing food. He died after 66 days, the first of 10 hunger strikers to perish. His funeral drew 100,000 mourners. His death did not end the conflict, but it transformed Sinn Féin into an electoral force that could not be ignored. The road to peace was tortuous, littered with atrocities and broken ceasefires. But slowly, through secret back channels, then formal negotiations, the impossible began to take shape. On the 10th of April, 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Power would be shared. Paramilitaries would decommission. The constitutional status of Northern Ireland would be decided by its own people. Weeks later, a dissident Republican bomb in Omagh killed 29 people, the single deadliest attack of the entire conflict. It came after the peace was signed, a final, hideous punctuation mark. Even that could not break what had been built. 3 decades of violence had ended not in victory for anyone, but in the exhausted, extraordinary recognition that enough was enough. The ink on the Good Friday Agreement was barely dry before the hard work truly began. Power sharing at Stormont lurched through crises, collapses, and restorations that would exhaust even the most patient observer. Ian Paisley, who had spent his entire career thundering against any accommodation with republicanism, sat down in government with Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin in 2007. The two men, improbably, seemed to enjoy each other's company. Journalists called them the Chuckle Brothers. It was absurd, and it was hope made visible. Decommissioning of paramilitary weapons proceeded, slowly and under independent supervision. The guns did not entirely disappear, and dissident Republican groups continued to kill, but the broad architecture of peace held. Northern Ireland built something it had never quite possessed before: the tentative, ordinary rhythms of a normal society. Then came the 23rd of June, 2016. The Brexit referendum was, in the minds of most who campaigned for it, about sovereignty and immigration. Ireland barely featured in the debate. When it did surface, it was brushed aside with breezy confidence. There would be no hard border, politicians insisted. No one wanted one. Somehow, it would all be fine. Northern Ireland voted 55% to remain in the European Union. It did not matter. England's margin carried the result. And suddenly the Irish border, that invisible line running through farms and villages and family histories, became the most complicated frontier in the world. The border question consumed years of negotiations. The solution eventually arrived at the Northern Ireland Protocol, later refined as the Windsor Framework, placed regulatory checks not between North and South, but between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. There was now, in practical terms, an Irish sea border. Unionists felt betrayed. The constitutional ground had shifted beneath their feet without anyone asking their permission. What none of the Brexit architects had fully reckoned with was this: the Good Friday Agreement was not just a political arrangement. It was a creature of European integration. The invisible border had been made possible precisely because both jurisdictions operated within the same single market. Remove that shared framework, and the invisible line threatened to become visible again. 8 centuries of entanglement had produced a knot that could not be cut without pulling everything apart. Demographics, meanwhile, are doing quietly what politics cannot settle loudly. For the first time in Northern Ireland's history, the 2021 census recorded more people identifying as Catholic or of Catholic background than Protestant. Sinn Féin became the largest party at Stormont in 2022. The prospect of a border poll on Irish unity, once unthinkable, is now a matter of serious political planning. 800 years after the first English lords crossed to Irish shores, the question remains open. Not answered. Not abandoned. Simply continuing, as it always has, into the next chapter that no one has yet written. 800 years of soldiers, statutes, starvation, and partition, and still the question endures, unresolved and restless. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to be forgotten.